2050, blah, 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 30 years of blah, 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 and where has that led us?
Welcome to Meaning It. At COP26 here in Glasgow, we're starting tonight with a bang with another sweary blast from the brilliant Juice Media, who rip away the veil to reveal why politicians love net zero and why we really shouldn't.
Hello, I'm from the government with an update on how we're handling the climate crisis. We know you're all counting on us to solve this problem so humanity can keep enjoying its favorite pastime, continuing to live on this planet. But you see, we've realized that we are the problem. And so, how shall we put this? We're actually going to get us all killed. Look at this graph shaped like a penis because it shows how fucked we are. This is where we are now. And as we can see, it's already pretty fucked with massive fires, floods, heat waves, locusts, bullshit. This is what scientists call the stop here or we're fucked point. And this is where we're currently headed, or as scientists call it, net fucked by 2050. The good news is we've promised to reduce our emissions. And if you take all our promises and add them together, that puts us on track for still very much fucked by 2050. And that's if we keep our promises. A big if, since some of our biggest promises are being coke-blocked by corporate coal shills, while others are nothing more than blah blah blah, or a plan printed on a pamphlet. Pamphlet? Our promises and pamphlets are also based on the hope that we'll offset our emissions with technologies which don't work or even fucking exist. Or with technologies that do work and exist, like trees. Except trees need time to grow, which we don't have. And space, which we also don't have. Plus, trees can burn, which seems to happen a lot these days due to climate change. And when they do, they release all that carbon they captured. Which means the only way we can keep our promises is to stop emitting carbon. Are we doing that? God, no. We've been subsidizing it at a rate of $11 million per minute, which discourages investment in renewables by distorting the market. And that's why there's a huge gap between our promises and where we need to be. We don't talk about that gap because that would entail a complex process called being honest. Being honest would mean admitting that we're failing. And we can't do that because then we'd have to stop failing. That would mean ending fossil fuel subsidies and banning all new gas, coal and oil projects. And to anyone suggesting harming our precious children like that, we say, how dare you? So being honest isn't an option for us, which is why we've come up with the next best alternative. Net zero by 2050. Net zero by 2050 means that instead of being honest this decade by taking this path, we leave the being honest part to the last minute by taking that path instead. As you can see, both lead to net zero in 2050, but they're very different journeys, because this path adds this many emissions to the atmosphere, and that one adds 3 times as much. And since emissions are what's causing the planet to warm, that means crossing the stop here or we're fucked point, which risks setting off irreversible chain reactions beyond our control. That's the exciting part of running an experiment with the only planet we know that supports life in the whole fucking universe, just so we can make a few billionaires even richer. Net zero by 2050. Anywho, feel free to take over from us at any time. Because as you can see, we're captured by the fossil fuel industry, compromised by our moral failings and lack of vision, and probably going to get us all killed. This has been a message from your local government franchise. Goodbye.
Authorized by the Department for blah, blah, blah.
So humans have caused all this climate chaos, but though we are now willing, or most of us are anyway, to admit climate change is real, we still don't seem to want to take serious enough action to deal with it. To understand why, I spoke with Chris Robertson, a senior member of the Climate Psychology Alliance. So welcome, Chris, to the show. Thank you so much. As you know, it's called Meaning It, and we're all about people meaning what they do or not meaning it. And it's clear to many of us that people, on the whole, have stopped denying the existence of climate change as a problem. They've stopped saying it's a hoax. And yet, there's some curious thing that happens that they know it and they say, I know all about it, don't you tell me any more about it. It's just insulting and patronizing that you should think I know more about it. and yet they're behaving as though they didn't know it.
Well, I mean, we all maintain our lives despite all sorts of things that would want us to change them, but we carry on just as we always have. And this process is called disavow, whereby we know something out there, but actually it doesn't impinge too much. So I managed to continue flying around the world for my holidays because I can. Or, why would I need to sell my car? Because, it doesn't make that much of a difference. So through a process of rationalizations and other means, I sort of distance myself from the horror of the climate change. And
Chris, could you say something also about the work you've been doing with Sally Weintrobe and others?
well, that is Climate Psychology Alliance. This is Sally's brilliant book on the psychological roots of climate change, which spells out in great detail and very practically how the process of disavowal happens and how we create these little bubbles of reality. She calls them fraud bubbles.
What I picked up particularly from her book is that our fraud bubble has been created by the economic system we live in. Neoliberalism, she said, is based on a mindset rooted in exceptionalism. In other words, on the fantasy that people in my bubble are separate from the people outside it, and we're superior to them. And that's something we've been seeing in the rise of white supremacy and Brexit and Trumpism.
These bubbles allow alternate realities, alternate facts, alternate truths. This is part of our age at the moment, isn't it? That we allow these to go on. But I think climate change is going to impact so deeply that they're going to collapse, and many of them are collapsing. Of course, when they collapse, the consequences are hugely painful. I mean, the monetary crisis had all sorts of consequences which are still playing out. And that is the problem with fraud, is when it collapses, people have to pay up, and it's often not the perpetrators. I've recently been interested in the connection between racism and climate change and the horrors of slavery, which we are all in the West, especially in Britain and America, complicit in. It's like when people are interviewed about this, it's just too horrible to really imagine yourself in the position of the slave owner. So you move into this sort of bystander position where you agree it's horrible, it's wicked, it shouldn't have happened, but it doesn't really affect me. So the horror of it sort of puts me at a distance.
I thought you were going to say it's painful to empathize with the suffering of the slave, but you're actually talking about it being difficult for us to empathize with the suffering of the slave owner when he realizes what he's been doing, because the slave owner is the person we're more like. I mean, we're the high consumers of the global north, and we don't want to recognize how complicit we've been in inflicting such terrible climate catastrophes on people in the global south.
I think the horror and the tragedy of what's happening with the climate, which makes in the last few months, or it's more than a year now, of the pandemic, is just going to put that into a distant perspective. We think this is awful, but the true, I'm trying to find the word, the calamity of a full-blown climate crisis and the extinction of so many animals that it's not just the odd few, it's going to get much closer to home, and it is terrifying. And how can you look at this? You can't. So this way of displacing it, distancing it, not looking at it, I remember what's come to mind is a great character from The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy who had two heads.
Oh, yes,
And he had a pair
Peter
of
Brooks.
dark glasses. And he had a pair of dark glasses that whenever anything frightening came on, they went completely black. So this is like a lovely image of anything that is too horrible. We find a way of distancing ourselves and making ourselves bystanders too, so it doesn't fully impact.
But how are we going to get past this? Because, you know, precisely because it is so cataclysmic, we will all have to deal with it and make changes in our lives, because otherwise it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. We won't change, and therefore it will be more cataclysmic. How are we going to really grapple with what each of us can do, either domestically or by pressuring governments to do something really big?
Well, I think for myself, I think there are little disciplines that are helpful in terms of whether you're recycling or whatever. Although, in fact, I think they make no difference to the whole. That is such a huge change that only governments and very big organizations can be involved in. But I still think it's a good practice. It's like a discipline not to feel entitled that you can have whatever you want. This is already a good discipline to start to develop.
So you're saying it's important to live differently, not only because it reduces our carbon footprint, but in a more fundamental way, in order to challenge the fantasy that our consumer society has deluded us with, that it's okay for us to all live like trainee billionaires, entitled to take and consume whatever we want whenever we want it.
My little bit is, how do you change the psychology and the culture? The fraud that is perpetuated on television that was supposedly a presentation of this wonderful new regime whereby we're all going to earn more and live better is extraordinary. It's difficult for me to understand how people believe in it. We are being sold a bubble and we're buying into it. And we live in these, so more and more now, we live in these bubbles where we self-perpetuate our sense of reality. And it feels like it's becoming less and less concerned with any truth. And yet there is this truth that is impinging on us, you know, whether it's going to be a hurricane or a flood. And one of the amazing things, interviewing people who've been through hurricanes and floods and fire disasters, is they very quickly afterwards want to return to life as normal. It's like, that was a little blip, you know, do not adjust your mind, reality is at fault. And that, you know, it's difficult to understand. Anyone who's lived through a fire that's nearly consumed your house can want to go back to normal. But it seems like a defensive psychological response to a trauma that is too much. It's too much and we can't bear it. So this is one of, I think, the key notions in the psychology around the climate, is that it's unbearable. So it's unbearable to face into these things. So we find all these ways of defending against it or deflecting it. And this is what's called the disavow, because the reality on the other side is unbearable. To face into it, we have to have a lot of courage. So in the Climate Psychology Alliance, we have these great events that are called climate cafes, where people can come along and talk about their uncertainties and their doubts and their worries, and how can we face into something that's so horrible and unbearable. And they hear that they're not alone in this, and that other people who are also struggling, and that it's not about an expert who's sorted it out. There is a sense of being together in a struggling community who doesn't really know how to face into the horrors. And I think it's going to be this mixture of the situation getting more and more obvious, and more, I'm really sad to say this, more and more awful climate events. And the denial is, actually I'm a bit sort of choked up with the feelings about what it has to be like before we really start to do something about it. From a psychological perspective, there's two things I can say. One is how to manage the fear, how to feel safe enough. And one of the things that we don't really understand in our culture is about soothing. So, I mean, mothers soothe babies, assuming they're able to, because a lot of babies aren't properly soothed, and that's the beginning of a trauma that continues. So, and we seek comfort rather than soothing, whether that's through drugs, alcohol, escapist literature, films. Our whole culture offers these escapisms, which gives comfort, but it doesn't really soothe.
So what would bring genuine soothing rather than comfort, so we can stop comfort consuming and meet our real deep down needs? And that's the key question, I suppose, that we each have to answer for ourselves, because for some of us the need may be to find a meaningful life, and for others the need might be to belong or to express yourself. For others still it may be to find peace or joy or connectedness or all of the above. And once we recognize our real needs, we may feel soothed enough then to face the real dangers and join those who are taking serious enough action against the destroyers of the planet.
So learning to soothe and be able to bear some frightening things is a very important process. And the other, which I'm keen on, but doesn't really have good cachet at the moment, is the imagination. And mostly when people talk about the imagination, they imagine some sort of escapist, let's imagine the future and we'll all have a positive role to play, and wouldn't it be wonderful? And this, we could say this is fantasy, but maybe it's not really the imagination. So the first step towards empathy is to be able to imagine myself like the other. So I can't remember in which conversation we were talking about slavery and racism. And yes, that being able to imagine myself as a slave owner is really putting myself in the other's shoes. And people have a huge resistance to seeing that I'm a perpetrator, I'm complicit in this. Because then you start to feel the pain of that and how awful it is. Not how awful it is out there, but how awful it is in here. And then I start to feel more empathy for others and recognize that, I have responsibility in this too. And that maybe breaks my heart open and I start to really feel things. Empathy-wise, it's a very important idea. And, having empathy also for the people who are carrying on as if nothing is happening. That's a really big one. And I struggle with that notion of how to empathize. So the example I'm thinking of as a psychotherapist or a sort of retired psychotherapist is 20, 30, maybe 30 to 40 years ago, child sexual abuse was on the horizon. And there was a huge denial about it. Nobody wanted to talk about it. In that way, it is quite like climate change. And gradually, people there was a sort of change in the climate where it became possible to talk about this. And of course, the victims started to talk more about it, and they started to be heard. And I think we're in a similar, sorry, pun intended, change of the climate. You've already said people are no longer in outright denial. So that we're in this process of disavow where it feels unbearable to look. And we take this sort of what I call the bystander position, where like, it is awful, isn't it? But what can I do about it? I'm helpless. Well, yes, it does feel helpless because it's so big, and humans aren't very good at dealing with huge things because we have to come together in the ways we're talking about. And the little bit of the psychology is sharing the difficulty and feeling that you're not alone in the struggle seems a very good start. I also want to mention one more idea, comes from the history of science. How does science have a revolution in understanding? How does Einstein's theory of everything suddenly be accepted where before it wasn't? And I love this idea from the historian of science called Thomas Kuhn, who came up with this notion of paradigm. He said, well, basically, they don't change. The old scientists die out. And I think young people have got it. So many young people have really woken up. And, Greta is a wonderful communicator who seems wise well beyond her age. And she's able to say things. I mean, the latest blah, blah, blah is just brilliant. And so many young people are aligned. They don't have the baggage. And they also are going to be the ones who are going to have to bear the consequences of our denial and disavowal and wish to carry on as we have. So, I mean, that's courage to the young people, I'd say. I think that's going to be the best show at COP26. It's going to be less around, I'm afraid, Biden or whoever coming up with something. It's going to be the young people on the floor who are going to be speaking the truths. And I'm hoping that that's going to be what communicates.
Well, thank you so much, Chris. It's been really great. More power to your elbow as you and your colleagues keep working on, soothing people or helping people to soothe themselves so they can actually open up and hear the terrible truths that we are going to have to really face.
And recognizing we really mean it.
Yes, exactly. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's all for this evening's show. I'll leave you with some heartening scenes of solidarity here in Glasgow among people from all over the world at this weekend's global rally.